With the Xiaomi 14T Pro, the aim, just like the other T-series models, is to build a phone that's as powerful as its flagship range but costs less. But by the time the 14T Pro was announced, the Xiaomi 14 price proper had been dropped to the point where they're almost the same. So it begs the question, is there any reason to get the 14T Pro, or should you buy the Xiaomi 14 instead? I'm Cam Bunton, this is Trusted Reviews, and in this video I'm going to answer that question. Look at these two phones side by side, and there's one design differentiator that's immediately obvious from just a quick glance. The Xiaomi 14T Pro is clearly bigger than the Xiaomi 14. Because it has a larger display on the front, it's a much larger footprint overall. It's taller, wider, and slightly thicker than the Xiaomi 14, and of course, it's a little heavier too. Now I'll go into more detail on the displays in a little bit, but that larger screen is perhaps one reason to go with the 14T Pro, purely because it's bigger. So you'll have a larger footprint for your games and your videos and everything else that you do on your phone. However, the smaller, more premium model has its benefits. It's easier to hold one-handed. It looks and feels a little bit more high-end than the 14T Pro does. Personally, I think it's a much nicer phone to look at, whether you're looking at the polished aluminium edges, the softer matte glass on the back, or even the camera design. Both are made from similar materials though, in that they both have aluminium frames and glass on the front and the back. It is worth noting though that the Xiaomi 14 has Gorilla Glass Victus, where the 14T Pro uses a non-named scratch-resistant glass. As for water and dust resistance, both have the same IP68 rating to keep out moisture and fine particles of dust or fluff. The newer model is tested to 2 meters of depth in water versus 1.5 meters, which is much of a muchness really. If either of these drop in the bath or in the sink, they'll be fine. The textured power and wake button on the right edge of the 14T is a nice touch though, making it instantly clear without looking that this is the button for waking and locking your phone. Now I've brushed on the surface of displays already, and the simple difference is that one is bigger than the other. But there is a lot more to it than that. There are a couple of other differences that lead me to recommending going smaller between these two, and it's not the only reason to pick the regular Xiaomi 14. One of those differences is refresh rates. Both can reach high refreshes. The 14T Pro maxes out at 144Hz, the 14 can do 120Hz. However, because the smaller model uses an LTPO panel, it can switch between different refresh rates depending on the content that's on the screen, and it moves between those rates quickly and instantly. So if you start swiping through the interface or scrolling up and down list, it'll immediately ramp up to 120Hz, and when it's still and not moving, it'll drop to 10. The 14T Pro can't do that. It'll switch between 120Hz and 60Hz most of the time, only ramping up to 144Hz when you're gaming or running benchmarks. And because it can't switch smoothly and quickly, there were a number of times I saw a bit of stuttering in the animations where the Xiaomi 14 was crisp and smooth pretty much all the time. I found them pretty similar in terms of colours and saturation, although the 14T Pro did seem to be more saturated than the 14, which meant colours were more vivid, but never to the point of feeling over the top. Now let's talk performance and battery life, if only because there is something of a surprise here. Perhaps not so much of a surprise that both are similarly capable in terms of running the most demanding fast-paced games titles, but as I mentioned, doing things within the interface and tapping and swiping on the screen, the smaller model just feels a little bit more snappy and responsive. Now on that note, there is something that you don't typically see on high-end Android phones these days. Sometimes I saw that when unlocking the 14T Pro and loading the home screen, there was more of a delay in loading the actual app icons on the screen. Sometimes I was sat there waiting for a few seconds when really they should be there instantly. However, once in the games, both feel like they can handle pretty much anything. Games didn't seem to bother them at all, and even if you were to benchmark the two phones, you'd find very little in the way of difference. The Xiaomi 14 scores slightly higher in most tests, but nothing to shout home about. The thing that surprised me more, which maybe it shouldn't have, was that the battery on the smaller model seems to last about as long as the larger battery on the 14T Pro. Part of that again is undoubtedly because of the more efficient display refreshing. What it meant was that despite having a 4610 mAh battery versus the 14T Pro's 5000, it was just as capable of making it through a full busy day. Comparing similar usage for me, which is about 2 or 3 hours of pretty casual usage, that's split between photography, YouTube, playing games and reading news and sports and social media, they'd both get to bedtime with near enough 40% left over. But if there's one thing that the 14T Pro absolutely wins at, it's the charging speeds. Its 120 watt wired charger can completely refill the battery in less than 20 minutes. The 14 is still very fast, delivering 100% charge in about 31 minutes, but it's just losing out a little there. The thing to remember here is that actually the first 80% will be topped up incredibly quickly, to the point where you could plug either of them in for about 15 minutes and have enough battery to get you through a day. For me, given how fast the 14 still tops up, it's not something I found made a huge difference in daily, everyday uses. But if you have to absolutely have the fastest, then the 14T Pro is the one. But if you compare either to the big names like Samsung, Google and Apple, they're both still really fast. Let's talk cameras, because I think again there's a case to be made here for the smaller Xiaomi 14 over the 14T Pro. Now, both do have triple camera systems with primary, ultra-wide and zoom lenses, and both have Leica's lenses and processing abilities. However, the smaller 14 has 50 megapixel sensors on all three cameras and can zoom to 3.2 times versus 2.6 on the 14T Pro. Plus, the ultra-wide has a slightly wider field of view to capture more of the scene. Now, looking at results, it's clear that both have strong systems, and while I generally prefer the smaller 14 most of the time, it's not perfect. For instance, the 14T Pro's ultra-wide seems to struggle a little with lens flare at times when there's bright light sources towards the edges. The 14 doesn't, but does seem a little foggy towards the edge. However, there does seem to be less noise in the blue skies than there is on the T-series model, and when you start using zoom, it doesn't seem to artificially smooth out details or produce as much exaggerated color. However, the zoom does seem to have a problem, particularly in shots where there are bright sources of light like the sun. It gets foggy, like there's a mist over the photos. The 14T Pro doesn't cope with hand motion as well though, and by comparison has a more contrasty, glassy, sometimes blurry result with unrealistic colors. You see some unusual differences when comparing how effectively they handle contrasting light conditions. For instance, those scenes where there's a really bright backlighting and HDR needs to kick in. Use the front cameras and the 14T Pro can't handle that at all. It left my face really dark where the regular 14 was much more capable at exposing to make it seem better lit and not just some harsh shadowed blob. Use the rear cameras and the rolls seem to reverse, at least if you use the main camera. The 14T Pro lifts those darker parts of the image more, effectively killing shadows to bring out detail, but in the process making the whole thing feel a bit unrealistic, because of course in reality there was a lot of shadow, where there now isn't in the photo. The ultra-wide camera by contrast isn't like that, producing photos that are dark and really shadowed. So you don't really get that consistency between the main camera and the ultra-wide camera. They do different things. So consistency is another thing that the smaller Xiaomi 14 does better. You don't see as wild a difference between the main, the ultra-wide and the zoom cameras, even if the results aren't necessarily perfect. Both have the option to switch between Leica Vibrant and Leica Authentic color modes. Authentic is a bit more muted and has less contrast, where Vibrant boosts the saturation in the colors and ups the contrast. I prefer Authentic, but when using Vibrant, the differences between the two systems were more obvious. The 14T Pro was just much more artificial looking. Everything from detail to color and the images just having this glassy, hazy, oversaturated look to them, it just felt a bit much. Shooting in lower light situations, the Xiaomi 14 shows its strength a little more too. Again, it was better at controlling lens flare, and the ultra-wide camera wasn't as noisy as the ultra-wide on the 14T Pro. This noise that you tend to see in the skies, for instance. The smaller 14 images were just cleaner in that regard. Shooting sunsets and moonrises, the 14T Pro struggled quite a bit with motion blur, but also creating a clean, authentic looking image, oftentimes processing the skies and the details so much it looked like it had been run through a photo editing suite and had the contrast and the brightness cranked up too far. The Xiaomi 14 also hides a fun AI trick in that it has this super zoom mode, which lets you zoom in and take a photo of the moon. Now, how much of this is actually authentically a photograph is up for debate. Well, really it's not, because it's not. But that's another story. it's still pretty cool. As for video, both again are strong, but they also both show similar weaknesses as with the photography. Xiaomi 14 was better at taming the bright skies and retaining detail, but that sometimes meant the objects in the foreground were darker and not as lifted. 14T Pro blew out the skies, but lifted objects in the foreground, delivering a much more saturated, colourful video. In the end, just like with any comparison, there will be reasons to go with either phone. But as a complete package, the Xiaomi 14 makes a better buy than the 14T Pro. Its cameras being more consistent with each other, the compact, more premium build, and the more advanced display on the front are the reasons that stand out to me. However, the 14T Pro delivers a very similar experience, except it has a larger screen for those who need a bigger panel, and it has faster charging for those who really want the fastest that you can get. Given that they're similar prices at the point I made this video, at least in the UK, price doesn't seem to be much of a consideration here. Let me know what you think of these two phones in the comments down below, or you can grab me on social media. I'm at Cam Bunton. If you did like this video, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe and tap that notification bell, and I'll see you again in the next one. Thanks so much for watching. Bye bye.